Good afternoon and an early Happy New Year to everyone, and welcome to the Angry Astronaut. Managed to track down my sunglasses. How about that? So, trying to get back into an angry frame of mind, although for this particular topic today, not really trying to be angry, instead, trying to be constructive. For those of you who watched my previous two episodes regarding Starship and NASA's plan to utilize SpaceX and Starship to go to Mars and some of the significant drawbacks with this plan, well, I'd like to present a potential solution. Now, one of the biggest problems with this plan, or indeed, there's a couple of them, but the most significant is the fact that according to the Delta V calculations made by European Space Agency experts who put out a paper on the subject, it's really not feasible for Starship minus Super Heavy to get all the way from Mars to Earth without taking a low fuel consumption trajectory. Think about it for a moment. Even though Mars' gravity is 1/3 that of Earth, it requires Super Heavy plus Starship just to get the vehicle into low Earth orbit, and then it's essentially out of fuel. Assuming, of course, that it has a full payload on board. So if the ship is going back, and even if it has a fairly light payload, that is to say, just the consumables and life support, etc., required to get 12 people back, it's just not doable. The numbers don't add up. Without Super Heavy, it's impossible for Starship to lift off from Mars, completely escape Mars gravity, and make it back to Earth in a reasonable time frame. On a low fuel consumption trajectory that would take nearly a year to get home, it might be more feasible, but again, then you need a lot more consumables, life support, etc., in order to make the journey. A chicken and the egg kind of situation, and there's no winning formula. And then, of course, there's the matter of trying to produce the necessary fuel and oxidizer on the surface. That's a serious problem as well. It's an enormous amount required to completely refuel Starship utilizing in situ resources, and the amount of time available and the amount of solar panels required in order to get the job done, even if we're assuming that harvesting Martian ice and CO2, that sort of thing is going to be a really easy thing to do, which is a big assumption. Even then, the requirements are massive. And this is something actually that Robert Zubrin figured out way back in 2019. And so he came out with a proposal called Mars Direct 2, which utilized Starship, except in a different way. And then an aerospace engineer named Miguel Guerrera, who I had an opportunity to interview on my channel, modified Zubrin's idea considerably, adding some additional features, additional technology, and just some additional infrastructure to make it even more feasible, and this is called Mars Direct 3. Then I added a few details of my own. So all of this can be done with Starship. Starship absolutely makes a journey to Mars and back a lot more feasible than any rocket we've ever had in the past. But it's going to require a little bit more innovation, a little bit of thinking outside the box to really make all of this work and to safely get the astronauts home. And I'm going to share all the details of this plan with you right now. So before we deal with the concerns involved with the SpaceX mission, before we even arrive on the Martian surface, I'd like to say thanks so much to Hayzegrayart for creating this incredible digital footage, and I want to encourage everybody to support his channel. It's all in the description. So yeah, before a mission even arrives on the surface of the red planet, there are some significant concerns with a Starship rocket-driven mission to Mars without any additional infrastructure in place. The main problem is the fact that in order to get a substantial payload to Mars from low Earth orbit, assuming you have a complete refueling, this will burn up the vast majority of the fuel available to Starship, leaving nothing to enter orbit. There will be no way to break into a controlled Martian orbit. Instead, you need to use the atmosphere to decelerate and land, meaning that if any sort of surface conditions change or become dangerous, for example, if we have a dust storm in progress that just happens to get kicked up in the time that passes between the time that Starship leaves low Earth orbit and arrives at Mars, you're going to be in some significant trouble. A dust storm would make the heat shield damage far more significant, and Starship almost certainly would not survive the process. So how do you get to Mars, and more importantly, how do you return from Mars utilizing Starship or something similar to Starship without burning up all of your fuel? Well, there is a solution that actually NASA has been working on for some time, and in my opinion, they're not going to embark on a Mars mission until this technology is completed, and that is nuclear thermal propulsion. I'm not going to go into all the details of how a nuclear thermal engine works. I've got other videos on that topic, which I'll be happy to link at the end of this video, but suffice it to say that a nuclear thermal engine utilizes the heat of a nuclear reaction to superheat a propellant and drive it out the nozzle at least 2 to 3 times as fast as a chemical reaction can drive propellant out a nozzle. So what that means is, with 2 to 3 times the velocity, you get 2 to 3 times the efficiency, meaning that it takes 2 to 3 times less propellant to achieve the same delta V, meaning that if you wanted to get to Mars in 6 months' time, you would still have a lot of propellant left over to brake upon arrival at the red planet and enter into orbit safely, and then land on the surface at a time of your choosing. Even better, chances are you would still have at least 50% of your propellant left over in orbit, and you could use this nuclear thermal engine, or rather a tug powered by nuclear thermal propulsion, to provide the necessary thrust and delta V to make the journey home, meaning that any rocket on the Martian surface would just need to achieve low Mars orbit in order to make the journey, and the rest of the fuel would be provided by the nuclear tug. The tug would have other huge advantages as well. For one thing, since it's nuclear powered and has an ongoing supply of electric energy, that means you could power a cooling system for your fuel, reducing bleed off perhaps down to even 0% while the tug was in Mars orbit or even in Earth orbit. And on top of that, it would be reusable, because once it arrived in Earth orbit after pushing the Mars spacecraft back home, the tug could be refueled with propellant from a Starship tanker, just like any other spacecraft being refueled in orbit, except it would require less propellant. So a win-win really with this type of technology, and again, it would require most probably a collaboration with NASA, because I doubt Elon is going to get his hands on nuclear reactors without their help. So that at least takes care of part of the problem. But Zubrin and Guerrera identified some other concerns with SpaceX's plans, which were uncovered later on by the ESA specialist that I put in my previous video. First of all, what do you do about the ice mining concerns? Because after all, we don't know exactly how easy it's going to be to extract ice, to process it into usable oxygen and hydrogen, and what about contaminants in the soil? It's very likely that there's going to be perchlorates that are quite unique to Mars that may be difficult to filter out. And these are the sorts of concerns that need to be addressed before astronauts arrive on the Martian surface at all. And then there's the matter of the energy requirements. Those are utterly colossal if you want to completely refuel a Starship with in situ methane and oxygen. The oxygen's a little bit easier because you have ice to extract the oxygen from it, but you need the Sabatier method and carbon in order to create the methane. And the 710 tons of fuel that we're talking about in this particular slide, I think, is a gross understatement. I think it's probably a good idea to have a full tank of fuel for Starship before it leaves the surface, given that it's not going to have super heavy to lift it as well. So you're looking at 1.89 megawatts of solar energy. This is going to consume 229.2 tons worth of solar panels and almost 3,500 cubic meters worth of volume. Now keep in mind, this doesn't include the mining equipment for the Martian ice. This doesn't include storage tanks for all that liquid oxygen and liquid methane. It's just the power, and that's going to require 5 to 6 cargo Starships alone just to carry the necessary solar panels. Now, a nuclear reactor might be able to solve a lot of these problems, but we've got to assume that using nuclear reactor after nuclear reactor may not be all that feasible for our first mission to Mars. And then we have the third concern, and the most obvious, and that's the fact that SpaceX is not really providing a great deal of detail as to how they're actually going to accomplish a round-trip mission to Mars, an exploration mission, that is. Really, what they're trying to focus on is the ship itself, and they're assuming that other companies and other institutions are going to fill in all the blank spaces. But right now, we don't have a comprehensive plan that includes all of those details in place, and if you don't have a plan this late in the game, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a manned mission to Mars in the next 4 years, as Elon keeps talking about. So how do we fix this? Well, 5 years ago, Zubrin came up with a very innovative but very simple solution. Let's take a lot less mass to Mars, at least as far as the human-rated spacecraft are concerned. Therefore, his idea was to build a mini Starship designed to be carried inside the fairing of the main Starship. The main Starship would then enter into a parabolic orbit, orbiting Earth that is, and then at the apogee of that orbit, they would release the mini Starship. This would require a lot less refueling for the main Starship because it just has to achieve a high parabolic orbit without actually escaping Earth's gravity. But most importantly, it requires 5 times less fuel and energy to deliver 3 times less cargo capacity. So yeah, less cargo, but still, given that mini Starship only has to use its own propellant to get from the apogee of this orbit to Mars, that's going to require a lot less propellant to deliver still a substantial amount of payload, about 26.5 metric tons for the human-rated ship, with a lot less propellant, meaning that you'll have fuel left over in order to enter a safe Martian orbit. And if you combine this with docking the mini Starship to a nuclear tug, you can get all the way to Mars without using any of mini Starship's propellant at all. Alternatively, you could also use the nuclear thermal engine to push the mini Starship, or the Caravel as Miguel Guerrera calls it, out to Mars a lot quicker, reducing the time frame to 90 days instead of 180 days, reducing the amount of consumables and life support required considerably. And as you can see from this diagram, the Caravel is a ship designed to carry 6 people to Mars. It serves no other purpose. It doesn't carry much in the way of cargo, rovers, anything else. It's just designed to get 6 people from A to B. By the way, you can see a full-size Starship in the background. We're going to talk a little bit about why that's necessary in just a moment. So once again, let's have a look at the Caravel and its actual capabilities. As we said before, 26.5 metric tons. Now, one of the big problems that we talked about with Starship carrying a dozen people for 180 days is the amount of consumables required. If we reduce that number down to 6 and we further reduce the transit time down to 90 days, the crew requirements improve dramatically. Now, of course, the weight for the scientific equipment and for the astronauts' equipment, EVA suits, etc., none of that changes, so 300 kilograms per astronaut times 6 means 1.8 metric tons for the total kit for the astronauts themselves. And then the consumables, oxygen, food, potable water, hygiene water, clothing, etc., that adds up to 7.74 kilograms per day times 90 days comes to just under 4.2 metric tons. So that means you only need 6 metric tons for the crew, for their equipment, and for all their supplies for a 90-day journey. That is a huge savings over the previous formula for a 12-person crew for 180 days. Now, what we're looking at right now are mini Raptors on the lunar Starship, and this is something that's going to be absolutely necessary for a Mars mission as well. Raptor engines, even at only 40% throttle, are going to kick up enormous amounts of debris when Starship makes a propulsive landing on Mars, and this could damage the rocket. Not a great thing for a human-rated spacecraft, but the mini Raptors will make a propulsive landing a lot less damaging to the regolith and a lot less likely to cause damage to the rocket, but mini Raptors are not going to provide enough thrust to slow down a full-size Starship. What they could do is slow down a mini Starship sufficiently to safely set down on the surface of the red planet without kicking up huge amounts of debris. The smaller the rocket, the less thrust you're going to require to make a propulsive landing on the surface. Now, I'm not saying that landing on the surface of Mars utilizing Starship and Raptors is impossible, but at the same time, that's something you want to risk with a cargo Starship, not with a human-rated Starship. And since you're saving so much space on crew quarters, consumables, life support, that sort of thing, you should have more than enough room to fit a modest rover inside the mini Starship as well, both to transport the astronauts across the surface and also perhaps to transfer fuel back and forth between the fuel processing plant, which would be brought down by the big cargo Starship, and the mini Starship. So let's get to the cargo Starship again, because we've mentioned it a number of times now. Why not use both the mini Starship and the big Starship for a mission like this? Why? Well, because Starship, if you're not returning it back to Earth, is actually incredibly useful for transporting enormous amounts of equipment to the surface of the red planet. As a matter of fact, a single Starship could carry all the solar panels that would be required in order to produce enough fuel and oxidizer for the mini Starship to make the journey back home. 1 Starship as opposed to 5. 10 refueling missions for that 1 Starship as opposed to 50. And there's an enormous amount of safety built into this plan. If the cargo Starship fails to deliver the fuel processing plant to the surface of Mars, then you don't send the human-rated spacecraft 2 years later. If the cargo Starship fails to set up the fuel processing plant, run into some sorts of problems with the solar panels, etc., then you just don't send the human-rated spacecraft. Very little risk in this plan. In fact, there's so little risk that fundamentally Mars Direct 3 doesn't even require a nuclear thermal tug. But let's go ahead and cover the mission again just to make sure we understand how to do this. First of all, the Caravel is placed snugly inside the fairing of Starship. Starship is definitely capable of carrying a spacecraft like this without any significant modifications. And you can see the Delta V capabilities of the Caravel, 2.7 kilometers per second, which isn't enough to get it from low Earth orbit to Mars, but it definitely is enough to get it from a high parabolic orbit out to Mars. Then again, if you use a nuclear tug to do the journey, then it keeps that 2.7 kilometers per second worth of Delta V for other maneuvers, for safely entering Mars orbit, or for some other purpose. It only requires also 2 tankers for the carrier Starship to get the Caravel out to the apogee of that parabolic orbit. So a lot less refueling missions also. So the Caravel makes the journey from Earth to Mars utilizing very little fuel in the process because most of the heavy lifting has been done by Starship, and then lands on the surface of Mars utilizing mini Raptors for the last stage of deceleration rather than a big Raptor engine, as I said before, is going to kick up lots of debris and add a lot of danger to the mission. But how do we make sure that other aspects of this mission are safe? Well, let me tell you something. Mr. Guerrera did a lot of work to try to cover every potential scenario where Martian explorers might end up getting killed, and to cover all of those contingencies quite thoroughly. First step. The human-rated Caravel makes the journey to Mars with enough fuel left over to do a free return trajectory if any sort of problems come up. Well, okay, that's not necessarily the first step, but that's the first safety detail that's taken care of by this plan. But the additional safety details are taken care of by the ships that are deployed ahead of time. First of all, you have 2 full-fledged starships making the journey to Mars, carrying the necessary mining equipment, solar panels, etc. to produce not only the necessary fuel for the Caravel to make a safe trip back to Earth, but also to deploy all the necessary habitat structures, greenhouses, etc. for the explorers. Also, you will see that this spacecraft has a Delta V capability of over 6.5 kilometers per second for its journey home. Reason for that is the extremely good thrust to weight ratio, even with only a single Raptor 2, and of course we're going to be using Raptor 3s for a Mars mission, and the extremely lightweight characteristics of the Caravel, you can achieve this kind of impressive Delta V, 6.5 kilometers per second, with this spacecraft on the journey home without any sort of assistance. That's barely enough to make the journey back to Earth. It also assumes that the Caravel is only carrying about 3 metric tons worth of cargo on the way back. Not entirely sure if that's going to cover all the necessary consumables for a 6-month journey or anything like that. In my opinion, the nuclear thruster or nuclear tug will make this journey a lot easier, a lot quicker, and a lot less hard on the Delta V requirements for any spacecraft lifting off from the red planet. The nuclear tug adds so much to a Mars mission, which of course is one of the reasons why NASA is pursuing nuclear thermal power. But in addition to that, you also, as I mentioned before, have 2 full-fledged starships and 1 Caravel as well deployed before the human-rated Caravel arrives on Mars. Why do you have all of these precautions? Well, it's all based on redundancy. What happens if one of the cargo starships crashes? Well, that means you're not going to have all of your fuel processing equipment, mining, that sort of thing, and the mission will fail. So you want redundancy. What happens if the Caravel experiences a problem? Crashes, but the crew survives, not that serious of a crash, but serious enough to prevent it from returning home. Well, you have a backup Caravel deployed close by in order to make the journey back home if necessary. So you have redundancy on top of redundancy. Also, what happens if the human-rated Caravel, the one carrying the astronauts, because of some sort of problem in the atmosphere, lands a considerable distance away from the other ships? Well, the Caravel has a pressurized rover on board capable of transporting the astronauts to their backup Caravel, where you have the necessary supplies and equipment to return home. And keep in mind, these mini starships, Caravels, whatever you want to call them, are based on existing Starship tech. The construction is the same, the heat shield is the same, the engines are the same. Very little changes involved, except for the fact that they're just smaller, so that means development time should be very straightforward and shouldn't hold up the mission that much. So that is, in a nutshell, what Mars Direct 3, with some of my additions as far as nuclear power is concerned, amounts to. Utilizing a lot lighter spacecraft, a spacecraft that will require a lot less in situ support to get back home to get the job done. Yes, it's only 6 astronauts instead of 12, but if we're talking about the initial mission, the first mission to explore the surface of the red planet and to safely bring them home, which will definitely help with the morale and the justification for sending another mission in the future as opposed to a bunch of dead astronauts, which will lead to a PR nightmare, to say nothing of all the grieving families left back on Earth. This is just a better way to do it. And there are other ways that you can add on to this plan to make it even better, putting a refueling depot in Mars orbit, for example, or perhaps exploiting the resources of the moon Phobos, which is most probably loaded with both water ice and carbon, pretty much everything that you would need to manufacture more methalox so you could refuel a full-fledged Starship in Mars orbit as well. Many ways to skin this cat, many ways to make a Mars mission utilizing Starship completely successful instead of a mission that lacks detail and has some serious gaps. Thanks very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. I'd like to thank all the new folks who have joined lately, quite a few of you, and also the folks who have supported me on PayPal. Thank you so much. I wouldn't be able to run this channel without you. So until next time, stay angry about space.